National service. Now, some of you are probably thinking, no doubt, that I might be a patriotic, flag-waving, chest-thumping, warmongering sort of guy. Well, I can assure you at the outset that I'm not wearing, underneath all of this, military uniform or fatigues. I'm not an agent of the Australian Defence Force or an agent of the Australian Security and Intelligence Service, really. And I can assure you as well that I don't sport any Southern Cross tattoos, though I'm sure that you were never in any doubt about that. But I do believe that patriotism can be a force for good and shouldn't be dismissed as an evil, but more on that later. I say all this because it might seem a little unfashionable for a 20-something Australian like me to speak in favour of national service. It's the kind of thing that you'd expect to hear from, or say, a cranky luminary of the RSL or perhaps a right-wing populist. And I'll be the first to concede that the very term national service carries with it some pretty hefty ideological baggage. It seems exactly like the kind of idea that a patriotic, chest-thumping, warmongering character would advocate. Because you think national service and you think conscription. You think of young men being sent off to fight wars in foreign lands, being asked to risk their lives for questionable causes by besuited men sitting in their offices tens of thousands of kilometres away. But I'm going to put forward the case this afternoon for why I think we should think twice about national service. The case for why I think progressives, those of us who believe in social justice and equality, those of us who believe in pluralism in society, and indeed those of us who are committed to individual liberty, can still find value in the idea of serving your nation. And my argument is one about the importance of valuing citizenship as the definitive bond that we all share as members of an Australian community. It's about how citizenship must involve responsibilities and not just rights, and must involve, I think, a willingness to make sacrifices for a common good. Now, it's not a vision of citizenship that everyone will agree with, but I hope that my talk today will at the very least prompt us to ask some very hard questions of ourselves and of our community. Now first, some context. As I've already said, there's a great deal of baggage with national service, and conscription has never really been popular in Australia. It's never been part of our civic culture. Back in the First World War, the issue divided the nation. Billy Hughes tried unsuccessfully on 2 occasions to introduce conscription in order to send troops to fight on the Western Front. And the issue was central to the first of a number of great splits within the Australian Labor Party. And of course, we all know that there's an election campaign going on, and I have no doubt that some of us are wondering whether we might even be seeing another split of the Labor Party taking place. In the Second World War, conscription was introduced, but even then there were limits on where conscripts could be sent. Basically, Australians couldn't be sent overseas to fight alongside volunteers. And it was only until 1943, after Darwin had been bombed and with the very real threat of an imminent Japanese invasion, that the Defence Act was amended to allow conscripts to be sent to all major war zones in the Pacific. As we all know, conscription was again very controversial during the Vietnam War. Compulsory military service was reintroduced in 1964 for all 20-year-old men, and those whose date of birth came up in the ballot were under an obligation to give 2 years full-time service. It was all very controversial, especially as opposition to the Vietnam War grew. And it was only with Gough Whitlam winning the 1972 election that national service was brought to an end in Australia. Now, this can be understood as part of a broader international trend over recent decades. Elsewhere around the world, many countries have dropped programs of compulsory national service. France, Sweden are recent examples. But there are still a number of countries that have retained national service. Switzerland, Germany, Israel, South Korea are a few of them. And last month, quite interestingly, the British Prime Minister David Cameron announced the introduction of a new national civic service scheme for young Britons, though the new scheme there was voluntary rather than compulsory in nature. The British have certainly been debating this over the last few years, and that's probably where my interest was piqued, since I've spent 5 of the last 6 years living in the UK. Now, the case I want to make isn't to reintroduce conscription or compulsory military service. So the kind of national service I'd advocate isn't the sort that countries such as Israel or South Korea have. Rather, I'm more sympathetic to the kind of scheme that currently operates in Germany, where young men, and it's young men in Germany, have the option of either military or community service. And indeed, in Germany, it's the case that most young men eligible for national service choose the community route rather than the military one. And I think in absolute numbers there are something like 100,000 cadets each year across Germany who receive a modest stipend for 6 months and in return work doing care for the elderly and for the disabled. So let me be exactly clear about what I'm proposing with the national scheme for Australia. I'm talking about a national scheme extending to both men and women aged 18 to 24, ideally compulsory, but quite possibly voluntary in nature, the pragmatist that I am. It'd be something that young Australians could take up right after they finish high school, something of a gap year before they start university or further education or a job, or perhaps even when they finish their university or further education studies, again as something of a gap year before they begin their careers. But those eligible would have the choice of serving something in the range of 8 to 10 months in either a military stream, which would involve basic military training, or a civic stream. This civic stream could involve a number of things. Young citizens could, for instance, work as assistants in aged care. They could work as cadets in a Green Corps working on conservation projects. They could work as part of an Australian Peace Corps working on development projects in the Asia Pacific. And young citizens who perform national service after university could conceivably teach at a disadvantaged school in a remote region of Australia. I know that America has a program of this sort called Teach for America, and I think very recently a Teach for Australia program has been devised too. So basically there's a lot here that a national service scheme could incorporate. It's not about simple conscription, it's not about military service, it can incorporate quite a lot. Now let's turn to some of the philosophical reasons for national service. I admit, I think it can be an easy criticism for some to make that my case for national service might just be the kind of kooky idea you'd expect from academics in ivory towers, not least political philosophers, who are gravely out of touch with reality. So let me put a human face, a human dimension on the thinking that I have here about national service. And I want to share with you today some of my experiences as someone schooled in southwest Sydney, yes, southwest Sydney, at a place called Helston Agricultural High School. I invoke my time at Helston in Sydney more than a decade ago now, because when I look back on my time there, I realised just how much of a social education I received. Social education. Let me explain what I mean by that. Now, I grew up in the ethnic melting pot of Sydney, in the suburbs of Canley Vale and Bonnyrigg. And as a young boy, I went to Canley Vale Public School, where something like 9 out of 10 students came from non-English speaking backgrounds. So my classmates didn't have names like Mick or Katie or Shane or Stephanie. They were more likely to have names like Fung or Wong or Dragon or Fatima. And let's put it this way, we didn't have ham, cheese and tomato sandwiches in our lunch boxes. But my experience at high school was very different. In fact, it was perhaps the complete opposite to my experience in primary school. I was one of only a handful of Asian kids in my year, and if memory serves me correctly, and I didn't have a picture of, or the school picture at home to check, but I think when I started at Helston, I was the only Southeast Asian or East Asian boy in my year. My school, needless to say, was very overwhelmingly white and Anglo-Celtic. And in fact, a third of its students were boarders. And these kids came mainly from the country. They came from farms in places like Wagga Wagga, Goulburn, Orange, Cowra. They wore riding boots. They wore R.M. Williams. They grew up learning how to throw a sheep or how to herd cattle into a pen. I'm telling you all this because I think common schooling can be the nursery of good citizenship. The school quad should, at its best, be a microcosm of the town square. At its best, it should be a place of encounters, a place where children from different backgrounds can mix. At times, these encounters will be difficult. They won't always go smoothly or according to plan. But in the long run, everyone benefits from interacting with those who mightn't be the same. And if I look back at my experience at Holston in southwest Sydney, I can remember that being an Asian boy at a school with lots of kids from the country in the 1990s, at the height of Hansonism, wasn't necessarily easy. But I'm still glad that I had all those encounters with the sons and daughters of farmers, kids who are very, very different from me. So what does all this have to do with national service? Well, it's got to do with citizenship. In an age when public education, I think, is in decline, when parochial schooling is becoming increasingly popular, when more and more people are living in gated communities, when our connection with society is likely to be dictated by our viewing of MasterChef as opposed to our interaction with our neighbours, I don't think we can take for granted that children will have the kinds of encounters with difference that are necessary for good citizenship. Indeed, even adult citizens seem less and less able these days to make the grade. We live in a society with an ever-shrinking common ground. We're defined more and more by our differences, not our shared values or beliefs. We're becoming more and more insular, more willing to indulge stereotypes. So whether it's atheists versus believers, outer suburban rednecks versus inner city Chardonnay sipping elites, the Judeo-Christian West versus Islam, we've basically forgotten how to be citizens unified by a common good. Now, it's my view that something like national service would be an opportunity for us to renew citizenship. I think it can generate a genuine culture of social encounters. School leavers would have the opportunity to meet other school leavers from different parts of the country, from different socio-economic backgrounds, from different cultural and ethnic heritage. So city and country, middle class and working class, white and brown, these are some of the encounters that I would see taking place. Imagine, for example, the school leaver from Kew working alongside a school leaver from Werribee or Frankston. Imagine the urban school leaver working on a conservation project, spending time in a rural community. National service can also generate a culture of active citizenship. It can encourage young people to believe that they're capable of making a difference. It can encourage them to think of service as, and the idea of giving back as something they can do as part of their everyday lives. Most importantly, I think it can encourage all of us to think of citizenship as a lived practice. I'm emphasising this because I think this idea is very central to what I'm arguing, the idea of living citizenship. Because I think we often think of citizenship as something very abstract. We think of it in terms of a citizenship certificate that naturalising immigrants might receive when they decide to become Australian citizens, or we think of it in terms of a passport or eligibility for a passport. And when we think of the responsibilities of citizenship, we're more likely to think of it in terms of an obligation to vote every few years. But I think citizenship has to stand for something more, because ultimately it's the bond that defines our membership of a national political community. It is precisely what is at play when we deliberate upon questions of public importance and also when we cooperate with one another. People like to think these days that any kind of other regarding action, anytime you do something for someone else, has to be motivated by altruism. But I think that actually gets part of the equation of social cooperation wrong. We've come to think of the world as divided between those motivated purely by self-interest and those who are pure of heart. But a community of citizens involves something different. It actually involves a community in which mutual interests and mutual concerns are what drive activity and what define relationships. Self-interest really becomes harmonized with a common good, and reciprocity in this sense means that the binary between selfishness and generosity is really a false one. Now, it's of course rare for people to speak about things like a common good. It all seems very old-fashioned. But I think we actually have been speaking about it in our public discourse in other terms. For instance, in terms of trust, in terms of social capital. National service would, I believe, be a valuable contribution to generalised trust and social capital. It would build bridges, not only between regions, cultures and classes, but also potentially, and I think very importantly, between generations. National service isn't just about young people. If done well, if there is a well-designed scheme, I think it's an opportunity to get older Australians involved in the civic sphere again. And I would envisage a scheme where older Australians can play very important mentoring roles to young Australians who participate in these schemes. But building bridges. This is why I would argue that national service is an idea not just for conservatives and reactionaries, but also for progressives. Progressives should, of course, have an interest in sustaining the conditions required for social justice. Now, we shouldn't forget that social justice involves us, very fundamentally, redistributing income and wealth and sharing resources, doing this through things like progressive taxation. This kind of cooperation is a lot more demanding than we might like to think. We take it for granted. But let's really think about what social justice in a liberal welfare state really means. It means that our taxes are being used to support public goods which are being used by strangers, by people we don't necessarily know. Now, progressives should also value pluralism, the fact that there will be a diversity of lifestyles, beliefs, values and practices in society. Modern society is deeply plural. We can't run away from that. But as a result, citizens must be able to exercise not just tolerance, an overused word in my opinion, but also mutual respect. They must be willing to reflect upon others' way of life, must be willing to revise their own beliefs, values and practices, and I think this is fundamental to what living in a multicultural society must mean. In other words, you have to take diversity pretty seriously. It's not just a gateway into exotic foods and restaurants. It's not just about kebabs and dragon dances. But all this is possible with only one thing. Much like social justice and redistribution, living with pluralism is only possible when you have some common ground and some shared understanding. Let me now say a little about the benefits that I believe national service would have for young Australians who would be eligible for it. One way of looking at it is really as a leadership opportunity. Now, I don't buy into the idea that young Australians, or young people, are all narcissistic and self-absorbed. If anything, young people thrive on responsibility. It's just that they don't often get a chance to exercise it. But imagine young Australians being given the responsibility to help care for someone else over a span of a few months, or the responsibility of being part of a platoon that's being trained to think about a purpose that's larger than just yourself or just me. I think it'd be a wonderful exercise in maturity and in character. And on this point, I think it's interesting that several studies in fact show that service learning can help improve behavioural and social skills, things like teamwork, critical thinking, and even public speaking. National service would also be a great way to convert gap years between high school and further education, or between further education and work, into a productive period of learning and contribution. And if we think about it, I feel like this is one of the ways in which we can address the possible concern that a compulsory national service scheme would be coercive or would violate individual choice. Because I think giving young Australians breathing space after they complete school to reflect on what they want to do with their lives and giving them a chance to expand their horizons by encountering others from different backgrounds can, if anything, help enhance the life choices that they would make. Now, this might sound a little counterintuitive, but just think about it a little. The idea here that national service could, in fact, enhance individual autonomy and choice. So where to now? In many ways, I feel like what I'm proposing isn't as radical as what it may seem. Aspects of a national service scheme, or of what a national service scheme can involve, already exist. AusAid, for example, runs a program for youth ambassadors to work in projects in developing countries. The Australian Defence Force currently offers gap year students the option of training with the ADF for a year while receiving a fairly handsome salary. I believe it's $40,000 a year. And there's been a lot of talk too about a green army to work on conservation projects around the country. So all these elements are already floating about. Where my proposal for national service might be seen as radical is that it would be integrating all these things into, ideally, a compulsory scheme. But even this, I don't think, is as radical as what we might believe it to be. After all, we're only one of two liberal democracies in the world where voting is compulsory. And I think it's fair to say that most Australians would defend compulsory voting as important. Important for enshrining the principle that citizenship involves a responsibility to participate in the affairs of our community. National service of a compulsory sort, in my view, would be an extension of this principle that is already held dear in our civic culture. And the upside of national service as well, the culture of social encounters, social trust and reciprocity, leadership experience and character building would all be greater if all young Australians took part, not just those who volunteered. And finally, I think it'd be more egalitarian if it were the case that all young Australians would participate in such a scheme. In particular, young citizens from lower socio-economic backgrounds would arguably benefit the most from the kinds of leadership and social skills that national service could develop. Now, there is, of course, the question of practicality. Having a compulsory scheme will cost money, especially if the participants should receive a modest stipend, and I think they should. It's also going to require administration and oversight. It's also going to require policymakers to design programs that aren't too menial or mundane, but actually stimulate and challenge young Australians. And finally, I think we should remember as well that while it's important to begin the practice of good citizenship at a young age, serving one's community isn't just something that only young people have the obligation to do. We should all be doing it. We should all be doing it over our life cycle. So this then is my case for national service. I don't think it's about a call to arms. I don't think it's about authoritarianism. But in an age when the individual and community are regarded as opposed, where the instinct is to ask, what's in it for me, or what about me, we should challenge ourselves to do better. And I think we should start by taking citizenship and its burdens more seriously. Thank you.